Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Soumya. I co-lead the organization with Aradhana, and it's incredible to see a lot of people from yesterday here today. And welcome to everyone who wasn't here yesterday, but is here to talk about menstrual injustice. I think that in itself speaks a lot about where we're all headed. So, as an organization, that has been our motive. Candice, Praveen, it's wonderful to have you here. We're so looking forward to hearing about your experiences. So what we do as an organization is deploy a holistic solution around menstrual health and hygiene management in rural communities in India, Nepal, and Africa, where we're focusing on awareness curriculums for all forms, all individuals who menstruate, women, girls, and also men, boys, and older generations, so that we can focus on awareness as a family unit, followed by increasing product access. So as an organization, we manufacture reusable sanitary pads and we cater to product needs via these pads across communities. And in order to ensure a long-term model, we've got a livelihood network where we train and employ village-level women entrepreneurs to actually continue the awareness and continue the product supply in the communities that we've intervened. So far, we've been able to reach 500,000 women and girls, but we're constantly trying to educate ourselves and constantly trying to have stirring conversations, which is why we're all here today. We're going to move on and start a discussion after a quick video that we built last year. 50 seconds.
Periods as a topic is so tabooed. There's so much shame associated with it. There is zero female healthcare seeking behavior. So if there is a problem, they will not voice it out loud.
Girls have to sit in the school for 8 to 10 hours and their only solution is to then not show up to school.
मैम बाला कंपनी ने पहले तो हमें मैम जानकारी दी, फिर उसके बाद में हमको बांटे है ना, फिर मैम उनसे बहुत कंफर्टेबल फील हुआ। मैं चाहती हूँ कि जो मेरी मम्मी, जो मेरी फ्रेंड्स हैं और जो मेरी बड़ी बहन है, उन सभी को माहवारी के बारे में जानकारी दी जाए और जो पुराने ज़माने की जो गलत जानकारी हैं उनसे दूर दूर किया जाए।
Great, thank you so much. Very excited to formally kickstart our conversation on period dialogues today with our first speaker, Miss Candice. Candice is an award-winning menstrual activist, academic, author, and social entrepreneur, and she's affectionately known as the Minister of Menstruation. Welcome, Candice. We're so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me, and welcome to this incredible period dialogue to everyone else who's joined in. I'm really looking forward to the conversations that we're about to have, especially from South Africa, just to share my experiences as a menstrual activist. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Lovely. I'm very curious, and I'm sure our audience is as well, Candice. How did the title of Minister of Menstruation come about? And what inspired you to become an advocate for menstrual health and period poverty?
Yeah, I think for me, whenever I think about what led me to become a menstrual health activist, I always refer to my first period. And I started at the age of 10, and I didn't have any conversation prior to my period starting around, puberty, around menstrual health. And so when this moment happened where I came back from school and I saw blood on my underwear, I really felt like I was going to die for the first time. I felt like I didn't know what was going on. And I felt ashamed, as if there was something that I did something wrong, as if it was my fault that this was happening to me. And so when I had this conversation with my mother, then there was a further sort of like emphasis to say, you need to keep your period to yourself. No one should know that you're menstruating. And that for me just led to me feeling more isolated, more ashamed, and keeping that information to myself. So I carried that stigma and shame for 11 years. And when I came across research around period poverty, because I actually started doing work at the United Nations as a junior consultant, and we were looking at period poverty in Eastern and Southern Africa, I actually found out that period poverty is a real issue. It's a real human rights issue. And yet no one's talking openly about it. And I think that really inspired me and sparked the work that I do today in South Africa and also as a menstrual activist. But it also meant that I had to unlearn a lot of the bias and stigma that I had carried myself from the age of 10. So I think, with any person who's listening to this and they're thinking, I want to become a menstrual activist, how do I start? It really starts with really unpacking and unlearning all of the negative stigma and biases that you have, whether it's intentional or unintentional. We all have some form of learning to do when it comes to menstrual health. And I think that's what really sparked me to say, this is something that I find to be very interesting. And I think this is something that society needs to know about. But also this is something that a lot of young girls in particular need education and need to feel empowered about. So that's what basically sparked my activism that's being played out today.
Lovely, Candice. It's so important what you brought up that, we didn't know about periods until they would actually happen to us. So in my field work, I've spoken to very young girls and no one tells them that something like this is going to happen, right? They're never prepared. And when they get their period for the first time, it's usually in school. And so they panic, they can't talk to a family member or a relative who can help them out. And I've spoken to some girls who think they're dying, like they think they have cancer. In some places, the stereotype and myths are so embedded, like you mentioned, in society and in our own understanding. They think they've been taken over by a demon or they've been possessed or cursed by a witch. And this is something that's such a normal biological phenomenon. And unfortunately, it's just shrouded in stigma. And what you mentioned, I really like the fact that you brought up unlearning, because how do we talk about destigmatization? You first have to unlearn for yourself so that you can sort of help continue that process for others. On that point, you did mention how very much embedded it is in society and cultural understandings, but how do societal attitudes towards periods actually contribute to injustice and period poverty? If you could shed some light on that.
That's a really great question, because I think it's ultimately saying, how is it that we still see period poverty play out today and lead to the injustices that a lot of girls, women, and people who menstruate have to live with on a month-to-month basis. And I think it's ultimately the silence that surrounds menstrual health that therefore leads to a road of implications of people are not speaking openly about the lived experiences, whether that's the pain management that they have to go through, or the period products that they use, or the period products that that are not accessible and therefore have to use alternative means, or just the taboos and stigmas that they have to sort of find themselves doing because society has said so. And I think the silence really is very generational, and that is passed down through mother to child, and the child becomes a mother and then they pass it down to their child. And there's no informative conversation that is really seeking to affirm and empower people who menstruate to say, this is what we go through month to month on the basis that our egg is not fertilized. And because of that, you will experience a range of symptoms. But not only that, I think for not having the open and empowering conversations about what happens month to month, that also means that then young girls will find themselves using an alternative means of products to manage their period, just so that they can go to school or go to their social economic activities. That means that a lot of young menstruators who will experience pain will think that their pain is normal because they've been told that that's what's expected. So there's just so many assumptions that a menstruator will live with because they're not having these conversations, because of the element of shame that is surrounded around menstrual health. Because as a society, we've deemed menstruation as a private issue. And what that means within a policy perspective is that private issues are often ever actually dealt with or actually resolved. And I think this is something that, not only is this the responsibility of states and governments to say, we need to respond to period poverty, but I think as individuals, we all have a responsibility to say, we need to speak about periods openly. It's not obviously going to take the whole conversation for 30 minutes, but ultimately having the conversation to say, why is it that periods are viewed so negatively in society, and see the different conversations that come out of that. And I think it's really important that period poverty isn't only painted as just a woman and girl's responsibility to deal and end the crisis with. Period poverty is everyone's sort of responsibility, whether that means if you are just someone who can donate period products, or you're someone who has the power to change legislation. We all have some role and responsibility to do so. And the only way we can do that is if we talk openly, if we engage in platforms like this, so that we can learn and also unlearn our biases, so that we can say something's got to change. Because it cannot be that a natural biological function is holding so many people around the world from doing their social and economic activities, that a natural biological function is holding so many people back from being able to access adequate wash facilities, being able to manage their period on a month-to-month with dignity and care, even though it is enshrined in the UN Charter for Human Rights. So that's something that we need to sort of like shift in terms of saying, you know, we know the information around how not having access to fundamental resources will have an impact on girls and women and people who menstruate. But now something's got to change, because we know that it's a real issue. What are we doing to change that? So it's about speaking openly and changing the silence around that.
No, I very often compare it to people who are familiar with Harry Potter. And you know how Harry Potter says that you must call him Voldemort. You don't say you know who. Like, it's not something to be quiet about or whisper about. You call it by its name. And even when I talk to girls and when we do our workshops, I say periods, say blood, say pad. Because just by using terms like that, you can actually kickstart so much change. And it honestly then creates a ripple effect. Like you said, everyone has to be part of the conversation. Candice, a lot of our audience might not be familiar with, let's say, what the role the state plays or the government plays in South Africa, what policies are in play, specifically in terms of menstrual health and hygiene. You know, there's so much movement nowadays where countries are making menstrual products freely accessible to either federal employees or in public healthcare centers. Could you just give us sort of an overview of what the state is like in South Africa?
Sure. I think, you know, it's really, from my own personal opinion, being a menstrual health activist for the past 6 years, there has been slow but fundamental progress in how the South African government responds to period poverty, but only from the provision of access to products. And I always just say that when we look at, you know, resolving period poverty, the crisis around menstrual injustice, what does that mean outside of just the access to menstrual products? It means that we have to ensure that we're looking at a holistic, sustainable approach that ensures that month to month, menstruators won't necessarily have to be terrified as to whether they'll be able to go to school or go to work or do any other social economic activities. But in South Africa right now, we have seen sort of rapid progress in the South African government sort of removing the tax around period products, but it still means that households that come from low income backgrounds still need to go to the store and buy these period products. South Africa has the most progressive constitution in the world, and yet also lives in the most unequal countries in the world. And that means that there's a high reliance on grants, where households would need the government to provide some form of money to be able to put food on the table, to pay for electricity, to have access to basic services. And by the end of all those payments, there's not even enough money to buy period products. And so there is a lot of rallying calls from menstrual health activists in South Africa to say, let's ensure that we have access to period products for low-income households, and that is for free. Unfortunately, because we also have government officials who are corrupt, and we have systems that can be easily taken over, we are seeing some form of willingness to implement those systems, but we have corrupt officials that are taking over those processes, and that means that schoolgirls, anyone who menstruates don't necessarily have access to those items. We don't necessarily have a legislative policy framework that speaks directly to addressing period poverty on the ground, but we do have a framework which is essentially a guide called the Sanitary Dignity Framework that tells government and also corporations, organizations on how to address period poverty. I think it's about time that we have the South Africa to say we need to legislate this, we need to make it a mandate so that the government can also set aside a yearly annual budget to address period poverty, not just only access to period products, but also to say we need to increase infrastructure, we need to increase access to education, and we also need to make sure medical care is affordable and accessible to those who need it. We also live within an unfortunate reality in South Africa that children are dying in toilets because there's this infrastructure called pit latrines. So it's just this long drop and children will literally fall and die. And so the reality is that if we are giving period products or pads to schools, children don't necessarily then, the girl child doesn't necessarily have the right capabilities or facilities to manage their period with dignity and care. So it is a long road to achieve period dignity and equity in South Africa, but it is time that government recognizes it as a human rights issue, but at least there are those conversations that are happening in the background.
I think that that's a very intelligent and smart and very realistic perspective that you've given us, Candice, that it's not just about a product. Like you can't just give a pad to someone and say, now you're free of period poverty. There's a whole context that you need to address, especially with the tax. So in India, sanitary pads were made tax-free a few years ago, but it's still very much considered a luxury product, right? You first want to satisfy your immediate needs, and then perhaps you can think about buying pads. But then again, the topic is surrounded in so much stigma. So how do you bring about the concept of a period budget where you need to allocate certain funds, possibly every month for something like that? And of course, the conversation does not end there. You need to talk about washrooms, making products available, how to even dispose of products, something like that, the entire chain. So yes, so that leads me to my next question as to how can we sort of work towards creating a more equitable society, right? Our conversation is around injustice. And we understand that to build an equal society, you need to be equitable at this point. So how can we, work towards creating a more equitable society in which these products and this infrastructure, these facilities are considered necessities rather than luxuries?
Yeah, I think firstly, I always say that we need to work on our own internal biases as a society. And I think it first starts off with the language that we use around menstrual health. I am the biggest advocate of the removal of words such as sanitary products because it implies that something needs to be clean, and feminine hygiene products implies the same thing. And so I just rather use the term menstrual products, period products. That implies that, these are products that are used to manage our period blood. There's no emphasis on whether this period is dirty or not, but it's just menstrual products. And I also do think that when we also sort of change our perspective of how we view something to be addressed. So if we actually label menstrual health or period poverty as a global public health concern or as a global public health crisis, that means that there's more attention to resolve the issue rather than just, saying that period poverty is something that impacts a select few of people or select regions of the world, when period poverty is actually something that is sweeping sort of states and nations around the world. It's not just only an Indian issue or South African issue. It is also an issue we're seeing in the UK and the United States of America. So we need to ensure that we, with our languaging, are positioning it in a way that allows people to recognize that not only is this just a third world issue, that it is a global issue, that it is a human rights issue that deserves enough significant attention so that not only the UN is responsible for setting, laws and norms and how governments should deal with it, but us as normal individuals know that this is something that requires our attention, that it allows us to lobby each other to say we need to do something in our own capacity. And I think beyond that, I think when we speak about menstrual equity and justice, I envision a world where boys and men are involved in these conversations outside of just, the responsibility and weight of women and girls and menstrual health activists carrying the work. I think boys and men need to recognize that they too have a responsibility in the world that they create. And it's also about the next generation of those boys that will become men that also either contribute to a period positive world or will continue to perpetuate the stigma and the shame around periods. So that's why it's as fundamentally important when we're speaking about menstrual equity and justice, that it is inclusive of education that has the boy child, so that the boy child is not curious and that the boy child is also not carrying on these stigmas or trying to bully young menstruators to feel ashamed around something. So it really is inclusive around just the languaging and also the inclusion of education. And I'm a very strong advocate about education, because from my own experience in South Africa, running our menstrual workshops, I've seen I've literally witnessed the difference between when we start the workshops and young people feel ashamed versus when we end the workshops and they can feel confident and empowered. And that is literally just an hour of their time, but it makes a life-changing impact, because now they'll view their periods in a more empowered and in a more fascinating way, rather than just viewing it in a negative way, right? So I think education isn't just the way we see it in schools. It's also, ensuring that they have access to literature, ensuring that they have access to affirming content that maybe is in different mediums and formats that can allow them to say, I need to know how to use a menstrual cup. How do I do that? And it's accessible, and it's not just something that they'll have to figure out on their own, and it's not just an isolating journey. So I think that is my answer. It's twofold, changing the language that we use, and also ensuring that our education is as inclusive as possible to change the narrative around periods.
Lovely, Candice. I'm just trying to keep up because you have such amazing points to make and you're putting them forward so lovely. But it's a very interesting point that you brought up, that this has to be a global conversation, right? It can't be just one entity, one organization, one country that takes on the responsibility. Now, and I know, and I'm sure a lot of our audience knows, who also especially working in the development sector, that it's great we talk about activism, creating access, creating resources. How do we create access to funding, right? Because I have noticed that menstrual health and hygiene is very often seen as an offshoot of health or gender or WASH, but it is very necessary to see it as an entity by itself. So perhaps how can we change that mentality? Because we want to do so much work, but it's difficult to access the funding to do that work. And I'd just like to sort of sum up everything else that you said, and then we can come to this question. So, of course, the importance of including boys, men, and individuals who don't menstruate into conversations around menstruation. And I loved what you said about creating access to education and resources, but also affirming content, that you're not alone. What you're experiencing, someone else has experienced something like this. And, creating a sense of community in that sense. But yes, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do we create sensitization around this topic, and what things do we put forward so that people are willing to fund projects like yours and mine.
I definitely think that I just want to touch on your earlier point about how sexual education needs to be affirming. I think we've probably all have experiences of the first time coming across sexual education. It was very awkward, or it was like our grandmother or mother telling us stories about someone getting pregnant, and then they said you mustn't get pregnant. It's never informative. It's never filled with information and facts. And I think for me, I want to see a world where a young person who's going through this transition of childhood to adulthood, which is also known as puberty, is not met with awkwardness, that they can be able to say, you know what, I'm noticing that my body is going through changes and I feel affirmed about it. And I think often a lot of people don't realize that menstruation is the final stage of puberty. And so parents need to also be aware to say that I see my child is suddenly growing hips, or their breasts are slowly developing, or, I'm seeing that their voices are breaking. I need to be having these conversations. And it's not just one conversation as if they're in trouble, but it's multiple conversations to enable a safe space to allow them to continuously have, these open conversations as they transition into growing up, right? So I think to answer your question about access to funding, I still to this day, I'm still trying to figure that out. I think being a founder and director of a nonprofit that it caters or delivers such a niche thing, which is menstrual education workshops, we struggle to find, ways to adapt to get the funding. We often are always funded from a service basis. So we provide a workshop, we get funding for that. It's never funding from an operational basis, for like 3, 4, 5 years. And I think it's because menstrual health management is such a new research interest and such a new topic of interest that we're only starting to have conversations today, that I think governments are now starting to maybe having to find the budget around whether they can be able to fund nonprofits that adequately address period poverty. And the only way governments can assign those budgets is when they've mandated it in their legislative framework. So in South Africa, we can apply for as many sexual and reproductive health grant funds, but most likely are always out of scope because our focus is only just menstrual health. And that is always so tough for us. But I think there are a lot of international organizations like WASH United, UNFPA, World Health Organization that collaborate with a lot of organizations and usually will have funding. So to help, nonprofits on the ground. And I think it shouldn't discourage people to not continue their work. When I started Curate, I started it as a student. I had little money. Every time we had to do workshops, I'd always use my last bit of money to get to a workshop as a way to ensure that the service was delivered. And eventually over time, through documentation and through the use of social media, then that was how we were able to get our current partners and clients to this day. And I think it's just a matter of remaining consistent. If you're very passionate about, serving your communities, eventually that passion will come through to someone that they'll be willing to align themselves to your passion, and then everything else will fall into line. So yeah, it's definitely not an easy road, but I think if you're always putting yourself aside and you're putting the people that you impact first, that is how it will remain sustainable. Yeah.
Lovely, Candice. I think what you shared, interesting point about when you said that you can collaborate with WHO, UNDPA, UNFPA. I think it's also important for all of us to understand that the space of menstrual health and hygiene is so very large, and we have such big goals to destigmatize periods, very possibly in this lifetime. So even if we can figure out collaborations within our networks, right, maybe we can access some sort of funding that way. Candice, I am actually really interested in your journey with Curate, and I know that you work with several different communities, but I would like to sort of draw your answer towards a specific point, which is, I'm sure you've seen menstrual injustice in its different forms, variety of forms. But I also want to understand, I know that menstrual injustice, of course, has a direct impact on menstruation, but how does this form of injustice impact different spheres of a person who menstruates?
Yeah, I think so. Can you try and rephrase your question again so I can answer
Yes,
it?
of course.
Because
So
it's so
no,
broad. I'm trying to make sure yeah.
No, definitely. Okay, so for an example, let's say I'm on my period and I don't have access to a menstrual product, which means I would choose not to go to school, which means I lose out on that day of education. So of course, the injustice comes from a menstrual injustice perspective, but my education is being affected. Have you seen something like this with the communities you work with through Curate? What other spheres are impacted just because of that one aspect being affected by injustice and period poverty? Does that help?
Oh, yeah, no, that helps.
Lovely.
So yeah, I thought I'd had to answer from a global perspective. So I was just like, okay, well, from Curate's perspective, we often hear that a lot of girls will miss out on school and they will never disclose exactly the reason why. They'll just say they're absent or they're sick. And it's ultimately because they don't necessarily have the period products to go about their school activities. And also I think when they are at school and they do have the period products, they struggle to concentrate in class. They also struggle to deal with the internal anxieties that they feel like their pad might be leaking and they'll stain their uniform. So when they are at school, it just feels like, they feel more stressed out than versus when they're at home. And so I think it for us, we always just say, well, what type of environment would you like to have in which you can be able to go to school so that you're not missing out on learning? And they often say, well, firstly, I would like bathrooms that make me feel comfortable enough to change my pads, that I can throw away my period products. But also they always say they would like maybe having a breakaway room so that they can take care of themselves, almost like a wellness room, where they can be able to take some time out, relax, maybe take a few medication, and then go back to school and, but still be on the school grounds. So there's obviously a lot of demands from these girls when we often speak to them. And it's also sad to see from our experience that most of the period stigma will come not from boys or the teachers, but from other girls as well. And that for us always shows that we need to accelerate the process of menstrual education within South Africa, so that the stigma isn't just, only focused on the attention of the boy child, but it's everywhere. Even teachers who still carry their internal biases, we need to put it to the side so that they can actually be teachers and not necessarily trying to make children feel less than because of a natural biological function. So those are the things that we see in terms of challenges. When they're at home, they feel bad that they can't be at school. When they're at school, they feel like the environment is not equipped enough to make them feel comfortable enough on their period. And so when we come in and we provide the workshops and we give them alternative means, as to say, when you are experiencing intense period cramps, just basically always ensure that you've got a hot water bottle, or make sure that you can speak to your teacher about this. That really just does give them the necessary empowerment and confidence to be able to speak directly to the girls and say, this is something that's a part of you, and it's going to be a part of you for some time, and you might as well just have the confidence than feel terrified and ashamed. So yeah, those are just things we've seen with Curate as some of the obstacles that periods have on girl child.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Candice. We have unfortunately come to the end of the time allocated for us. But if I could sum up our conversation, it's awareness, we got to accelerate, and we have to affirm. I think those are the 3 A's that we can sort of condense our very lovely and diverse conversation into. But thank you so much, Candice. I absolutely love speaking with you. And I really hope that we can continue conversations like this, because I learn a lot from these conversations. I get inspired. So it was lovely speaking with you. Everyone, please drop in your comments, questions, insights for Candice in the chat box. We will get to them after our next panel. At this point, I'd like to invite my co-moderator, of course, who's now going to be our moderator, Ayushmita, to take period dialogues forward.
Thank you, Parul. And thank you so much, Candice, for that wonderful conversation, those wonderful insights that you shared. Our next speaker for today is Mr. Praveen Nikam. He's the founder of Samata Center, a non-profit organization focused on improving access to quality education, improve accessing MHHM and SRHR information through after-school program. Praveen Nikam is both a lawyer and an educator, and was awarded with the National Youth Award by Government of India for his exceptional work in youth development and training. Welcome, Praveen. How are you doing?
Hello all. Hey, I'm doing good. Thank you.
All right. So jumping straight into our conversation, Praveen, my first question to you is, what are your thoughts on men in menstruation? I think it's about time we address the elephant in the room. What do you think about men in menstruation, and how do you envision it to play its role in ending period poverty and period illiteracy?
Right. Firstly, thank you so much for having me here as a part of this esteemed panel. It's a great honor, and I also want to thank my team who thought that I can be one of those who can represent the organization and the work that we are doing as a collective. Men in menstruation. For me, it was back in 2011 when I was an engineering student. On my visit to Northeast, I happened to meet a girl who was forced to leave school because of her first period. And that was an eye-opener incident for me, coming from rural Maharashtra, going on a study visit to Northeast, and experiencing a situation where a girl is being forced to leave her school. When I asked her father that why she's not going to school, he replied that हमारे समाज में जब लड़के को महावारी शुरू होती है, हम उन्हें school नहीं भेजते. In our community, when the girl starts menstruating, we do not send them to school, and they used to see it as a punishment by God. So this had a deep impact on me. I came back to Pune. I realized maybe I need to do something. I was young, and one of the immediate decisions I took was to drop out of engineering. Yes, I took a decision to drop out and switch to pursue something that will help me provide some solution to this cause. I was quite naive as well. I never had those resources. I never thought about it, to be honest. But I switched to doing political science. I shifted to Pune city, and I was then exposed to a world of development sector, met different non-profits, and there were some learnings as a part of these process. One of the biggest learning was that menstrual experiences are not only shaped by gender, but it is also race, it is also caste, it is also religion, it is also region that has a deep impact on it. And in order to address menstrual injustice, I think it was also important to have a lens of intersectionality and a lens of inclusivity in order to acknowledge and challenge the barriers that exist, as well as amplify the voices of the marginalized groups, and then talk about menstrual equity. So these were some of the learnings as a part of the last 10 years journey that I, along with my team, we have been trying to do. And then the conclusion was that it is important to reach out to boys. It is important to engage boys as a part of discussion on gender equality. It was important to get teachers on board who can facilitate discussions for a long-term impact. And I think it for us it helped. I mean, helping men to become allies as a part of this movement was very important. Helping them understand why it is important to understand the challenges faced by all those who menstruate, to understand the issues that women have to face when they're a part of a community or as a part of a home, and the role that a man can play as a brother, as a father, as someone who loves his partner. So I think helping them to become an ally was something that we realized will play a long-term impact. One. Second was helping them educate, helping them understand about their own body and the body of their partner had a deep impact. I remember talking to teachers, Zilla Parishad teachers in rural Maharashtra, men who were surprised to know different aspects about their own body. But they were very positive, they were ready to adapt, and trust me, teachers have been doing some wonderful work at the grassroots. So that was a second learning, that it is important to go back to the square board, help them learn about their own body and about the other aspects of the human body, and make them an equal shareholder in this whole issue. And the third important aspect, which was, I mean, we were more concerned about how do we tackle this power relations. It's so difficult, right? When we live in a community where patriarchy is so strong, helping the male understand that, okay, you need to make sure that there's decision making in your family, there is equal decision making when you are in a community, when you are at a workplace. So I think that power relation, that giving an equal opportunity to everyone who is a part of a small or an extended community of decision making also will play an important role. And that's how our experience and learnings were in the last 10 years. And of course, we can definitely see that, yes, we need to put the men into menstruation. They are a major stakeholder.
Yes, absolutely. Although I wish all men would drop out and do something like what you did. But anyway, moving on to our next question. We are right out of a global pandemic, which has, left real devastation and distress along its way. How has COVID-19 pandemic affected individuals who experience period poverty, especially those who rely on school or other workplace resources for menstrual products?
Right, right. I mean, everyone who are a part of this broadcast right now are equally witness that what we all went through during the pandemic and what were the challenges, because we all, either in our house or in our neighborhood or whatever we were able to witness online, were able to see how things were functioning. So one of the major issues was also of those young girls and others who menstruate from the trans community living in rural areas. One of the major access point for many was the Zilla Parishad schools. That is something I can say for the state of Maharashtra, and I'm sure these centers would differ for different states. But schools played a very important role to distribute sanitary products. With the closure of schools, that was one of the biggest challenges. How do you access these products? One. Secondly, lack of financial resources. With everything being closed, it was difficult for people to have the necessary money in place to actually buy products and support someone in the family or support themselves. So I think these were two of the major challenges. And of course, it ultimately led to isolation and stigmatization in the long run. So these were some of the important challenges I feel we all experienced. I mean, I can't claim to be an expert who only knew what happened that time, but yes, how did things roll out on the government front? I think I was expecting more on the government front, where there will be more support available, but unfortunately, sanitary pads were not a part of the essential kit that the government is trying to reach out, and that's how we lost on a major chunk. How did it impact? I mean, let alone the girls, but what about all those who were differently abled and who had no resources to support them? What about those who come from trans communities and had no one within the supply chain, within the network to support them? So I think these are some of the important challenges that many faced during the pandemic, and people are still suffering from it, is what I mean.
Right. Absolutely. I do agree with you. And I think that periods is an issue which is almost always an afterthought, right? Like a disaster happens, we stop manufacturing period products because we think that it's not necessary. And the manufacturing started after a week, right? For 1 week,
I
there
mean,
was the manufacturing.
unfortunately, the whole debate shifted. Of course, no doubt. The whole debate I mean, it has to be about providing oxygen cylinders, making sure that the hospitals have necessary resources, but that doesn't mean that you can altogether shift focus. I can definitely say, I'm sure many here who are a part of different non-profit organizations can also experience in terms of monetary support. I think in the previous panel where we talked about the necessary monetary support, it is difficult for non-profit organizations now to ask for support to initiate a sanitation initiative or to initiate a program which talks about menstrual hygiene, because majority of the corporate do not see as an area of intervention right now. For them, it is something that, okay, that was a buzzword for some time. Now we have some different priorities and we need to shift focus, so we can't support this intervention. So it's unfortunate.
Right. Absolutely. I do. I completely agree with you. Going back a little bit to the policy space, because we don't live in a vacuum. Policies affect everyone, each one of us. Like Candice said, periods are something which are considered private, something that happens to female bodies, those who are assigned female at birth. And because they are considered private, in many cases, the government doesn't really want to intervene with policies, laws, which comes into the private spaces, right? How do we change the narrative? How do we make periods a policy issue, not just something that happens to people who are assigned female at birth? How do we make it a public policy issue?
I mean, as a part of a union dispensation which is hostile towards the rights of trans communities, as a part of an ecosystem where talking about equality is a challenge, I can definitely say it's a challenge. It's really a big challenge. But why not? Why it has to be a policy? Because 50% of the majority menstruate, so they are an equal shareholder when it comes to elections. They are an equal shareholder in terms of casting their vote. So they definitely have the right to talk about this basic necessity that exists. I think it is the responsibility of each and every young person who are going to vote or who are already voters to hold their elected representatives accountable. I mean, that is the easiest way. How can we make it a part of the policy discussion? Let alone other interventions by non-profits, or let alone other interventions where you engage with a young bureaucrat who is positive. Those are different interventions. But can we at an individual level reach out to our immediate corporator, to our immediate mayor, to the member of parliament, and can we please ask them that what they have done in order to make period poverty eradicate in their own constituency? Apart from that, are we as citizens aware? Are we aware that every district, I'm talking about India, every district in India has the District Youth Advisory Council, where each and every young person has an equal place on the table, where we as young persons can reach out to the district collector and point out our issues that we feel are important. And it is mandatory for the district administration to make sure that they take up the issue during the development council's meeting. So maybe also there are responsibilities on our side as young people. And these are some ways where we can make sure that the whole issue of access to menstrual products and access to sanitary facilities are being brought on board, apart from engaging with your elected representatives. But even, I mean, going one step ahead, can we just look out the codes that exist, the sessions codes, the district code? Do they have the necessary sanitary facilities in place? Do they have the necessary aspects that can help all those who menstruate? Talking about educational institutes which are nearby, can we just write a letter to our vice chancellor inquiring what steps that they have taken to make this space safe for everyone who are a part of the community?
I think that's a very, very interesting point. And that reminds me, here in Delhi, where I am at, an organization did start this menstrual audit of district courts in Delhi.
Interesting.
And
Wow.
what they started collecting data, visiting the courts, and started looking at the infrastructure, if it is period friendly. And I remember some pictures about how terrible the women's washroom is, and how unsanitary it is. Right, so it's a very important point that you bring up, that we need to question the public infrastructure also, if it is enabling enough for somebody who, for example, lives on the streets and is dependent on the public infrastructure to manage their periods. What about the mohalla clinics in Delhi?
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about Swachh Bharat, and there is a Swachh Bharat rating, there are rankings on ease of living in the country, which is good. A very important initiative to trigger the district administration to make the necessary resources in place. But if I can talk in the city I get to work in, Pune city, I can easily quote an example of the Ferguson College Road, one of the prominent busiest streets in the city of Pune, but which lacks necessary public restrooms. And whatever restrooms that we have, there's only one restroom for a street which caters to more than 10,000 people in a day. I'm quoting even less than the regular footfall, but it even doesn't have a proper public toilet. So one can imagine if this is happening on the Ferguson College Street in the city of Pune. I'm not sure what's happening in Bid. I'm not sure what's happening in Nanded, Latur, Satara, Usmanabad, in Ranikhet, in Uttarakhand.
Talking a little bit more about policies, because we seem to have ventured into that area, and it is a little interesting, and it resonates with me also. When we talk about government policies and government initiatives, especially in a country like India, which is so hugely populated, and we have so many people who menstruate in our country, there's always a debate around quality versus quantity. Like, do we supply sanitary products to the masses, which may be cheaper in quality, but ensures the availability of a menstrual product? Or do we also make space for good quality products, which not just focuses on the availability of a menstrual product, but also takes into account the fact that it is about the health of the person who menstruates? How do we navigate this debate around quality versus quantity in the MHHM space?
I would like to, very important question, and it's a dilemma that many like me face while, and I'm sure many on the call would be also in a similar dilemma while we all are working at the grassroots. The issue of access. Let's talk about disposal. So when we talk about making available products which are not in good quality, which will also impact the health, but what about disposal? Every Mahanagar Palika, every municipal corporation in India, as a part of the Swachh Bharat guidelines, needs to have a sanitary pit to dispose of the sanitary products. I don't want to take names of municipal corporations, but I'm sure they do not even fulfill those mandatory guidelines as a part of Swachh Bharat. And these cities are being ranked 1 and 2 in the Swachh Bharat rankings. They have been ranked 1 and 2 in ease of living of Government of India standards. And Pune is a wonderful example. Pune is a beautiful city. Pune is been run by, Pune's biggest strength are the rack pickers. We call them Kachra Vetsak. The rack pickers are the biggest strength. I would love and request you all to please come and talk to rack pickers and understand what their challenges are. People are not ready to even segregate dry and wet waste. They want to put in everything in one bin, and they expect that the woman who comes there, it's her job. They do not have the audacity to talk to her in a language where they can ask her to request her. No, it's all like, ye aapka kaam hai, aapko karna chahiye. So I think when the debate of quality and quantity comes in, I think quality is very important. We need to make sure that we have necessary sanitary bins in place which can take care of the disposal. we need to make sure that we talk about those products which will not impact the bodies of individuals. And also at the same time, we want to make sure there is access. But with the affordability issue, people say that, oh, menstrual cup is a wonderful initiative, but बहुत महंगा है, शायद से हम नहीं खरीद पाएंगे. तो हम वो सैनिटरी पैड लेके आते हैं जो शायद से क्वालिटी में अच्छा नहीं है, सस्ता भी मिल जाता, लेकिन उसके डिस्पोजल के लिए हमारे पास पर्याय व्यवस्था नहीं है. So there has to be some conclusion, some decision among the non-profit organizations as well, that what we are trying to promote, and are we actually helping to achieve a logical solution, or are we still contributing to the problem? And it's a tricky issue which needs a broader debate and making sure that all stakeholders are on board.
Right. Thanks so much for answering that, Nikam. It's definitely makes me think that as people who are working in the MHHM space, and as so many of us who are trying to achieve a similar goal, it's important that we answer this question for ourselves, that are we looking at the same goal, or are we looking at the same outcomes of a particular goal, or are we just running around? And I'm sure that running around is not going to help us in the long run, and we need that plan of action in place.
I just have one small point to add. I mean, I always feel we are losing the bus. I mean, the problem is there are two issues that needs to be addressed. Helping people understand that it is natural, and it's not something related to any beliefs. It is not something that culture promotes. This is a natural thing, and we all have to go through it. It is as natural as breathing. So helping people understand their body, I think, is one of the biggest issues that we need to address at the primary level. And then comes the whole idea that how do we provide and what kind of sanitary protection that we are going to use. So they're two different things. What happens at the end of the day, we end up talking about the second solution, but we forget talking about the first one, which is very important. Because if you're able to address the first one, I think we might have some solution on the second.
Got it. Praveen, since we are talking about policies, and no policy can exist only on paper, it is very much about strategic planning, writing of the policy, but also very, very importantly of the implementation of a policy.
Right.
And India, we have a constant problem of policy implementation. Scheme implementation is a big challenge. Our budgets are underutilized, which is why the allocation decreases. It's a never-ending problem. When we talk of policies, when we talk of menstrual policies, apart from, of course, great planning and considering all those things, what should be the monitoring and execution plan? How can mapping the ground level impact, how can we map the impact at the ground level, at the community level that we are trying to achieve? And how also do we hold people accountable for the implementation of these policies and schemes? Because I feel that we as players in the community, in the space, also have a responsibility to hold our policymakers accountable, like you rightfully said at the beginning of this conversation.
Right. So you talked about the budget, you talked about the policies, you talked about government mechanisms, you talked about holding people accountable. Yes, I mean, I think 2014, 2015, 2016, when there was a buzz, if I can put it that way, with movies, with series around the whole issue of menstruation and access to menstrual products, the government seemed to be very active. The government, every state government had its own initiative of providing free standard napkins to school children. I can talk about the state of Maharashtra. The then government did announce an initiative where they guaranteed that sanitary pads will be provided to each and every school, and I'm sure consecutive governments in Maharashtra. Apparently, in our state, we always have governments every 6 months, a new government every 6 months. So it's difficult to hold who is accountable for what. But consecutive governments in the state of Maharashtra have made sure that they definitely work on the issue of menstrual hygiene. But there has been a challenge. I think the politicians on their front, they make announcements, they come up with policies, they allocate the budget, and then their job is done. They either get re-elected or they are shown the door by the people. But a mechanism which is constant is the administration. And I feel the buck stops there. It is important that the administrative officers are holded been accountable. I mean, they need to be held accountable in the implementation of policies. When you have a minister which is very vocal on issues, the administration works, and you end up having a minister who hardly even talks about it. The administration even is not concerned. I, at the same time, am not judging all officers. We as an organization had support of some wonderful officers who went beyond their mandate to support us so that we can scale up our activities in rural Maharashtra. But different verticals in any government, whether it is the Mahila Bal Kalyan Vibhag, whether it is the Department of Youth Affairs, whether it is the Department of the District Administration, they need to make sure that these policies are intact. Because there is a budgetary allocation, they need to make sure that all the budget has been spent. As citizens, it is a responsibility to check whether the budget has been spent or not, to ask questions, to file RTIs, to reach out to our immediate officers, to check whether they have actually implemented the policy which the government portrays as a part of its election promises. So that is something very important. In terms of making sure, how do we map the impact? I mean, that's really a difficult question. How do we map whether I mean, can there be a social credit system? Credit system which will hold the concerned department accountable in terms of spending the budget, one. So if a department is able to spend all the budget, they need to be awarded. There has to be some incentive that goes to them. There has to be also incentives for non-profit organizations who make sure that the government budget has been funded. So there has to be a collaborative model. I mean, it is important to get on board the civil society organizations. So all those civil society organizations who play an important role to make sure that the budget is implemented will also need to be incentivized. For me, this is a very organized, structured, and formal way of holding people accountable. What are the informal ways? Of course, which I have mentioned earlier, that writing letters, initiating signature campaigns, creating public awareness, asking your elected representatives about the initiatives they have taken. These are the informal methods where we as citizens, we as civil society organizations and activists have a role to play in holding the system accountable, in making sure whether the actual budget is being implemented or not. I hope I am answering your question. Yeah? Okay.
Yes, absolutely, Praveen. Thank you so much for answering that with so much intelligence and grace. And it makes me think that